When leasing commercial space, companies must decide on the length of the lease term. This decision is influenced by a number of factors, including but not limited to growth projections, continuity of operations, build-out needs, economic conditions, etc. Market conditions outside the tenant's control can also have an impact. Retail landlords, for instance, generally require minimum 5-year leases. Another example was during the early years of the Great Recession, when landlords were willing to agree to nearly any length of lease term, sometimes as short as 1 year, just to get their spaces leased. In this series, I'll be discussing the most common/traditional lease terms, 3-year, 5-year, and 10-year, but we'll also touch on less conventional terms, shorter than 3 years, between 5 and 10 years, and longer than 10 years. I will touch on the who, generally prefers which, what you can expect in concessions as a result, and why tenants may choose one over the other. 5-year leases. Why? 5-year leases are the most common lease terms, and in many cases, the reason is simply because it's the default lease term. Many landlords require a minimum 5-year lease, retail particularly. In addition, 5 years is both short enough and long enough for companies to forecast and make accurate projections. Finally, if a company wants or needs to modify/customize their space, a 5-year lease generally provides enough term over which improvement allowances can be amortized. Who? Most established businesses lease commercial space for 5 years. As previously mentioned, retail tenants are generally required to enter into a minimum 5-year lease. What? Depending on the asset class, nature of the tenant's business, and extent of the build-out and finishes, a 5-year lease can get you a brand new turnkey space. This applies mostly to office space where layout/office configurations are relatively uniform, reusable by subsequent tenants, etc. Due to the uniqueness of retail and industrial tenants' uses and associated infrastructure and build-out needs, the amount of money in the deal may or may not be sufficient to cover the cost of the improvements. Retail rates are relatively high compared to office and industrial rents in the same market, which in theory would afford a higher improvement allowance. But because each retail tenant's business has proprietary specs, their build-outs are generally more expensive. Industrial spaces are generally leased in larger square footage blocks, with a relatively small proportion of the space actually being built out. Thus, the impact of the improvement allowance is magnified. For example, an industrial tenant that leases 20,000 square feet at $10 per square foot, triple net, and receives a meager $5 per square foot tenant improvement allowance has $100,000 to spend towards build-out. If they only require a 2,000 square foot showroom or office space, that improvement allowance actually equates to $50 a square foot, 100,000 divided by 2,000 square feet.